Matthew, I may need it. I didn't know whether by sitting on the far end here I was going to be going first or last. I was concerned either way. I felt if I went last I probably wouldn't have much to say other than to agree with my four fellow panellists, and I feared by going first that would give them plenty of time to disagree with me. So we'll see how it goes. I mean, my basic analysis is that the government seems to be addressing a number of different issues or perceived problems. Or some of them are actual problems, of course, the deficit, sluggish growth and the imbalance in the economy. So I don't think there's one standout sort of story or strategy from the autumn statement. But the Chancellor appears to be doing this in a rather piecemeal fashion, addressing each of these issues, and in certain areas even in a counterproductive fashion. I'm sure that I think it's likely that most of the other panellists will echo my view that things are probably even worse than we feared. Each of the 5 panel discussions we've held here, Matthew, I think each one's been in bleaker and bleaker economic circumstances, and this is no exception. I'm not an economic forecaster, but my tip would be if over recent years you'd taken any economic forecast and about halved its level of optimism, you would have been somewhere near the truth. So that's probably what we should continue to do for all such forecasts in future. Firstly, deficit reduction, and talk of a potential plan B owing to growth being considerably more sluggish than was predicted by the OBR at the outset. It seems to me as if, in broad terms, unless there is a dramatic change in growth on the upward side or spending on a further downwards side, that the coalition government is actually going to end up carrying out the shadow Chancellor's suggested deficit reduction strategy of a year ago. That is to say, rather than eliminate the deficit in the course of the Parliament, they will end up broadly halving it. So we're in the strange position in which it looks like on the numbers to me that Ed Ball's professed policy will actually be the one that is conducted with regard to deficit reduction. With that said, if we started out with the Shadow Chancellor's policy, I think it's doubtful whether there would have been any deficit reduction at all, but nevertheless that will be where it is on the numbers. So what's going to be interesting is, in order to make Plan A stick, whether, and this is my concern, the Chancellor considers Plan A to be the proposals in the Comprehensive Spending Review, that's to say a cut in real government spending of about 3.5% over the course of the Parliament, or whether he considers Plan A to be the deficit reduction target. If he considers it to be the latter, then he is either going to have to find considerable additional tax revenue from somewhere, or at least open the door to a further round and consideration of spending cuts. And I hope that he at least opens that door a little. So I think that he is not, he clearly won't admit, and I don't think he is actually in Plan B territory, but because of the woeful levels of growth, he is in Plan B territory. And the deficit reduction figures announced a year ago are going to be nowhere close to hit without a significant change of policy emphasis. We at the IEA, of course, if you haven't seen it, produced our own comprehensive spending review this July. I think there are some copies outside. Very simple, straightforward steps to knocking another £224 billion off government expenditure. Very simple and straightforward. Possibly echoing Ronald Reagan's dictum that whilst there are no easy solutions in politics, there are indeed simple solutions. And I hope that the Chancellor does look at, or at least opens the door to, some consideration that further spending reductions are going to be necessary. Now, some of what we know is in, or is very likely to be in the autumn statement. I'll just touch on a few of those areas. I am concerned by the moves on credit easing and borrowing. It seems to me that the government risks failing to learn some of the key lessons of the global financial crisis and is actually seeking to make, if you like, debt less risky rather than saving more attractive. Underwriting mortgages for first-time buyers, ensuring greater lending to SMEs is part of the problem, not the solution. And rather than trying to make debt less risky, they should try and make savings more attractive, which I think requires easing off the gas on a lot of the pensions proposals. In terms of infrastructure and private investment in infrastructure, I think there could be that could actually be a welcome move. My heart sank when I heard that the government had a substantial new infrastructure programme, but if the detail of the proposals is principally about facilitating private investment in what remain public sector projects, then although that would be a second best solution, it's a step in the right direction. Of course, the nettle that needs to be grasped, particularly with regard to infrastructure spending, is planning liberalisation rather than elegant schemes to try and get the private sector involved. With a more liberal approach to planning, we would already be building additional airport facilities in London and the South East entirely at the expense of the private sector, which has now been ruled out. On deregulation, we've seen some modest steps in the right direction. I wish that the government had had the courage to implement the leak crop proposals in full, but nevertheless I found myself in the unusual position last week of taking to the airwaves to defend Vince Cable and warmly welcome some of the steps he was making. But I would like to see that more content on exemptions for the SME sector. This causes us some degree of angst at the IEA because there are substantial distortive effects on the market by treating SMEs differently to other companies, and problems about where you set the ceiling and therefore what disincentive effects you have to move beyond that ceiling. But nevertheless, some steps here I think would be welcome, principally because the regulatory burden on business in the UK is so great that regulation acts effectively as a poll tax, and therefore there is a case for giving smaller companies an opt-out, and we've outlined some of our proposals in this booklet, which is also available at the back. Scrapping all the auto-enrolment in pensions for small companies has already been trailed. I'm not sure whether we will actually see it as boldly as suggested on the front page of City AM today, but ensuring that companies with less than 50 employees don't have to go through this compulsory pensions enrolment would be a step in the right direction. I'd also like to see a greater war on red tape in this area, small firms able to take on employees who retain self-employed status, exemptions for SMEs from the right to request flexible working, right to request training, statutory holidays and the minimum wage, and allowing small firms to discuss retirement arrangements with employees without threats of age discrimination legislation being invoked, and allowing as far as possible temporary contracts of employment in the SME sector that do not have the same level of employment rights. The government, I think, are taking modest steps in this direction, but probably only going about a third of the way that I'd like to see them going. Finally, on taxation, at the outset, the Chancellor's broad aim was to split deficit reduction in an 80-20 split. I think he's already accepted he's not going to quite keep the tax burden down to 20. And my concern is that there doesn't seem to be any consideration at HM Treasury about which taxes may now be on the wrong side of the Laffer curve. So the solution to raise more taxes to cut the deficit is always that an increase in taxation will raise more revenue. I hope he makes plain and pegs himself to the report that we're expecting from the Treasury in, well, I'm told January, but I think it's much more likely to be February, on the impact of the 50p rate, which I'm confident will show that it raises no revenue and it actually has a disincentive effect. I hope that the Chancellor makes plain that if that is the case, then he will be arguing for it to be scrapped. He will scrap it indeed in the next budget. But I think that he needs to investigate whether he's got some other taxes on the wrong side of the Laffer curve as well. I think that actually the rise in VAT to 20% may place it on the wrong side of the Laffer curve. Some of the work that David D. Smith has done in this, included in our Sharper Axes pamphlet, suggests that actually the rise may be counterproductive in that whilst it generates obvious streams of revenue, it mitigates against employment. And I hope at some point there's some urgent attention given to the highest withdrawal rates on income which kick in after £100,000, where you're facing effectively a tax rate of over 60% because of the withdrawal of the threshold. So I'd like the Chancellor to investigate as thoroughly other taxes as he appears to be investigating the 50p rate. So I think the picture is bleak. I think the Chancellor's not going to accept that he's in Plan B territory, but he's in Plan A minus territory. I think some of the piecemeal changes on credit easing, borrowing are the wrong way round. The devil's in the detail on infrastructure, and considerably more needs to be done on deregulation and tax reform in order to actually ensure that the now downgraded forecasts stick rather than are halved again in the next 12 months.